Hey, and welcome to another Ask Me Anything videocast where I, Chris Clemmons, try to answer your burning political questions. So today's topic has to do with mass shootings, mass murders in general. The reason I'm going to kind of talk about this is it's kind of at the forefront of the discussions being had on social media and politics. Overall, this is the subject that everybody's been focused on for the last week. And what I've seen is essentially a divergence back to the normal political points that everyone likes to, throw back and forth at each other, and we haven't moved the discussion forward by any means. We just are stuck in our own political camps, and beyond that, we're not listening to each other. So I'm going to try and go through this particular issue in a little bit different of a fashion. I'm going to try and actually address all the points of both sides and really try and move this discussion to somewhere more productive, because I don't think we're having a productive conversation. We're just simply creating a further schism between both the left and the right. And I honestly would really like to see this issue get fixed, so to speak. So I'm going to start off in a slightly unorthodox point of view by talking about students, teens today, because those are the ones that are being affected the most by these school shootings. So when we look at teens today in America, 12% of our students are reported to have a major depressive episode in the last year. That comes out to be something like 3 million adolescents ages 12 to 17 have undergone a major depressive episode. Now, when we look or we compare those numbers to the numbers of students who are reported to have anxiety disorders, students who are reported to have issues with ADHD, the numbers get really big. It's not just 12%. We're talking about 20 to 25% of our students are having real psychological issues coping with classroom and life situations in the 21st century. So what does this look like when it comes to actual performance in the classroom? We have all these depressed and anxious teens. Well, what other evidence do we have to suggest that the school system isn't necessarily serving all of our students very well? Well, let's look at absenteeism. When we look at absenteeism, this is essentially defined, chronic absenteeism is defined as 15 or more days missed in a given school year. There's about 186 school days in Kansas. So you're talking about 10% of the overall school days you're not showing up. So 1 in 10 days. Well, the numbers overall of all students is about 18.7% are considered chronically absent. When you break this down into its respective demographics, black students make up 23% of 23% of them are chronic absentees. 20% of our Hispanic students, 17% of our white students, 9.3% of our Asian students are chronically absent. And our Native American students are 27.5%. They make up the largest percentage of students who are chronically absent. Now, if we break this down by sex and by age, the numbers get even more interesting. So when we look at the younger students, our middle school students, the numbers aren't nearly as bad. However, what we really notice is that male students tend to not show up more often than female students. And that trend continues when they get to high school. So as they get a little bit older, the numbers increase in terms of how many students are not showing up to class. And the male students, again, are on the top of that category. Girls tend to show up to school more often. They also happen to pass classes more often. So looking at, pass-fail rates. Students passing, then I'm just going to use the KCK school district's numbers. Students passing all of their classes. Male students, only 57.5% of them in middle school are passing all of their classes. Girls, on the other hand, in middle school, 76.6% of them are passing all of their classes at the middle school level. When that changes and goes to high school, 35% of our male students are passing all of their classes, and 50.9% or 51% of our girls are passing all of their classes. When we look at disciplinary records, as students get older, the disciplinary issues get more and more and more. So what are we actually seeing? Well, what we're finding is as students get older, their needs for socializing with other people, for figuring out how to interact with individuals, grows. What do they get less and less of as they go on? Time to socialize. Other things to mention, well, as you get older, you start to develop your interests. You start to figure out who you are, and you start to understand what it is that you enjoy doing, what you want to learn about, what you want to do with your life. And what we find is as you get older, those opportunities are getting less and less as well. You have to take this many science classes, this many math classes, and guess what? Home ec and shop and all those things have been done away with because we need you to pass a high-stakes standardized test pushed by the federal government and state governments. So as students get older, we see more and more of them disengaging from the education process, fewer and fewer of them actually wanting to show up to school. And we see an increase in psychological trauma, depression, anxiety as students age as well. All of this speaks to the fact that our school system overall is not operating with our students' best interests at mind. While teachers and administrators might say what we want is for students to succeed, what we're really focused on is standardized tests. In the 1950s, your elementary school kids probably had 2 to 3 recess times a day, as well as a long lunch period and times for play within the actual classroom. They weren't forced to sit down and take tests and do worksheets and so on and so forth over and over and over again. Today, students are lucky if they have one recess. When you look at middle school level and high school level instances for students' ability to actually have control over what they do. Well, when in the 1950s there was home ec, there was shop, there was all sorts of different classes. There were hunting classes. Believe it or not, there was actually firearms classes you could take in high school back in the 1950s. All of those things have actually been removed from the classroom. There's very limited options that students have beyond just what is considered academic. So your math, your science, your English, so on and so forth. So we've given them less and less control over time. Even look at lunch periods. Back in the day, in the 1950s all the way up to the 1980s and even into the 90s, the average lunch period was more than half an hour. As a matter of fact, most of your high school students in that time period had about an hour worth of lunch time to socialize and interact with their peers. Maybe they got stuck in a bunch of classes with people they don't like. Well, hey, I at least have an hour's worth of lunch that I can go and talk to the people who I relate with. Well, all of that has been taken away. In KCK, for example, the lunch period that our students are given is 25 minutes. That's from the time they leave the classroom to the time I come and pick them up from lunch. 25 minutes in an entire day for themselves to socialize. So let's say you're one of those kids who's considered a little bit weird and you get stuck in a class schedule. You don't have any say, especially at the middle school level. You have almost no say as to what you're able to do on a day-to-day basis, what classes you take, where you go, so on and so on. It's all decided for you, right? So let's say I'm a little bit weird and the 25 or so individuals in the classroom that I happen to be stuck in, I don't like. Well, unfortunately, unless I somehow come out of my shell, I'm not going to have any friends in those classes that I'm taking, and every day I'm going to come to class and go to these be with this group of individuals that I don't like, that I don't get along with, and I have no ability to talk through my issues with people who might be experiencing the same things, so on and so forth. So I become isolated. And if I don't have any choice over what I want to learn, let's say maybe we're talking about biology, and I have a question about physics, and I ask my teacher, well, my teacher's generally going to say, well, hey, that's a good question, but that's not what we're talking about right now. If you want to learn about that, you need to wait until high school. And by that time, that moment of inspiration has been lost for that student. The idea is, or what I'm driving at, is that at a very early age, students are realizing that what they want and what they find interesting is not important to the system. The system doesn't care. You're going to learn about what we tell you you're going to learn when we tell you to learn it. And this teaches our students that their preferences don't matter. And if they want to do something beyond what is considered the academically appropriate, well, they find that, their purpose in life is not being fulfilled. And, when you're a kid, 18, 21 years old is a long way off. and it seems like an impossibly long way off, especially to drudge through a school system that you're not engaged in. So these absentee issues, these passing all your classes issues, the constantly being sent to the office because you can't sit still, those types of things have to do with how we've set up our schools. There's no academic choice. There's no ability or time for students to socialize and interact in the way they've evolved to do so. And overall, this is breeding, at least in about 20% of our kids, some psychological issues. Now, on average, are those things worked out by the time they graduate? Yes, but there's always outliers, and that's the thing to focus on, because these mass murder events are the outliers. So what we need to be focused on, number one, is trying to change the education system so that it works for our kids. Because, suicide rates are also up amongst teens. Something like 2,000 students every year commit suicide. Most of them are male. More than 2/3. Actually, it's 1,500 males committed suicide last year, school-age males. 500 females committed suicide last year. So not only are we talking about absentee being mostly males, failure rates being mostly males, disciplinary rates being mostly males, ADHD being mostly males, but suicide rates are also mostly males in the school system today. Our school system is not working for young males. Now that's not, a woe is the world type of an argument, but it's something we desperately need to look at, because it's also the males that are shooting up the schools. And these mass murder events are a symptom of an underlying sickness within our school system, and it needs to be solved. Now, moving into adults, because it's not just students who are committing these mass murder events. We need to also look at, what is the average American's life like? On average, the average American is an unhappy individual. 1 in 6 individuals are using anti-psych medications, antidepressants, or anti-anxiety meds. So things like Zoloft and Celexa and Xanax are the top 3 most used medications in that category. The medicinal side effects of these drugs are things like nervousness, insomnia, agitation, hallucinations, suicidal thoughts, and hypermania. 1 in 6 individuals in the country are on these types of medication. And the problem is, with this particular issue, is that these medications are being used to cover up psychological trauma. There's a reason why people are unhappy, and instead of addressing why they're unhappy, they're instead trying to cover it up with medications so that they can cope. The same thing is true when we actually look at the rates of people using things like marijuana or alcohol or opiates. These substances, when they are being abused because there is an underlying issue of psychological trauma that's not being addressed. And we have a culture in our society that says if you seek help from a medical professional to deal with your psychological issues, your personal or emotional issues, that you're a weak person. Everyone wants to talk about suck it up, Sally, or pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and that has real psychological consequences when we talk about our culture. People are afraid to seek real help. And I bring this up because the suicide rates today, 45,000 people committed suicide last year. Of those 45,000 people, 7 out of 10 of them were white males. Again, back to the school issue, back to now the workplace issue and psychological trauma. What is it that our culture constantly says? If you're a male, you have to be tough, you need to be able to handle things on your own, and if you can't, well then you're a weak individual and society does not value you. That's why 7 out of 10 of these people who have committed suicide are males, white males in our country. Again, the same people who are shooting up these schools, same people who are shooting up these malls, so on and so forth. We have a real cultural issue here, and it's not being addressed. So, things to mention when it comes to, again, substance abuse and unhappiness. When I say at least half of Americans have a substance abuse issue, it's not just drugs, it's also food. 50+% of Americans are obese or overweight. Anyone will tell you who understands nutrition and health that 90% of your body weight has to do with the food that you put in. Only 10% has to do with exercise. So what's going on? People are literally overeating to make themselves feel better, or eating the foods that they know they shouldn't because they're trying to, again, feel happy. They're trying to get to a baseline. And it's not working for a lot of people. Again, 45,000 people a year commit suicide. Now, a lot of people will say, well, half of those individuals committed suicide with firearms. Maybe if we reduce the amount of firearms, we could reduce some of these suicides. Well, mentioning that, it's an interesting point, and I understand why some people say that. However, gun laws have no correlation with the suicide rate. Here's what I mean. In South Korea, it is illegal to own a gun. If you have a gun, you actually have to store it in a police station. South Korea is number 10 on the list for number of suicides. In fact, most of the countries that are used as examples, a lot of our northern European countries and things of that nature that are used as examples for gun control policy, actually have much higher suicide rates than the United States. So there's absolutely no correlation between tougher gun laws and preventing suicide. Any psychologist or psychiatric care physician will tell you that reducing suicide has nothing to do with the tools used. It has to do with dealing with the underlying psychological trauma. And that, again, is the point here. We have a culture that is sick. And until we solve those issues, the murder rates, the mass shootings, the suicides will not stop. And addressing it at a tool level issue, kind of like with addiction. People want to talk about, well, what if we get rid of alcohol? What if we get rid of marijuana? Well, guess what? People are still going to become addicted to something. They're going to find a means to get a hold of the substance that they're addicted to. And until we can, again, deal with the underlying issues, we will not end the addiction problem. Now, let's talk about some of the statistics. Let's just go into homicide statistics. How many people are being murdered in the United States every year? 17,250 people were murdered in the United States in 2016. Of those, 11,000 of them were committed by firearm. And of those 11,000, only 150 or so were committed by rifle. I mention rifle because, on average, most of your murders are being committed with this thing right here. Most of the murders are being committed in our inner cities by gangs or violent criminals. People who should not legally be able to own a firearm are getting a hold of handguns, things that are very easily concealable. As you can tell, you didn't see that, right? And not only are these easily concealable, that's part of the reason why they use them, but let's say you're actually operating one of these things and you're a felon. Well, guess what? You're violating the law by owning a firearm. The law itself did not prevent you from using this or obtaining this. Right? There's 300 million guns in the United States and 340 million people. There's almost a gun for every single person in the United States. And unless we go door to door and confiscate every single gun, there's no way to prevent these things from ending up in the hands of criminals. So what we have to do is focus on reducing crime, not reducing the tools of which they can get their hands on, because they're always going to find their way to a gun if they so choose. And again, most of the murders that have been committed in the inner cities where crime is high. And where are these places that crime is high? Where we have low socioeconomic status, where we are sending our adults, our males, the father figures of these families to prison for drug-related crimes. Things of that nature, right? So unless we address the real underlying issue, the homicides won't go away. Let's continue, though. Let's actually look at some of the statistics, because people want to introduce a lot of ideas for how we can solve this issue, and a lot of it has to do with prohibiting or restricting the use of guns. Brazil is number 1 on the list of murders per capita. Brazil is number 1 on the list for murders overall. The population of Brazil is 207 million people. That's 40,974 murders were committed in Brazil last year. In Brazil, all firearms are required to be registered with a minimum age for gun ownership being 25. So there has been a suggestion that we raise the age of gun ownership. Well, you can see here, this has been issued in Brazil, and Brazil is number one on overall violent crime. It is generally illegal to carry a gun outside of a residence, and a special permit granting the right to do so is granted to certain groups such as law enforcement and security personnel. So very, very strict gun laws in Brazil, yet they have almost 4 times more murders in their country and 2/3 the amount of citizens that we do here. So a very, very high murder rate. India, number 2, population of 1.324 billion people. There were 40,752 murders in India in 2016. In India, guns are strictly regulated by law. There's been 2 acts that prohibit the sale, manufacture, possession, acquisition, import, export, or transport of firearms and ammunition unless under a license, which is very difficult to obtain. Mexico has a population of 127 million people, and in 2016 there were 25,757 murders. Under the Mexican Constitution, citizens and legal residents have the right to own arms, but may only carry them in accordance with police regulation. Applicants must have a clear criminal record and proven income and residence, i.e. they cannot be homeless. New firearms are purchased through the Ministry of Defense. Prohibited weapons include large caliber handguns, shotguns with barrels shorter than 25 inches, or bore greater than 12 gauge. So anything stronger than a 12 gauge you're not illegally allowed to own. Rifles, which are fully automatic or of large caliber are also illegal. 1 handgun is permitted for home defense. For hunting and sport shooting, up to 9 long guns and 1 handgun is permitted. Requiring membership in a hunting or shooting club, collectors may be authorized to possess additional or prohibited weapons. A carry license must be issued to those employed by private security firms or those that may be targets of crime. Point is, Mexico has much stricter gun laws than the United States. They have 1/3 of our population, and they have more than 2 times the amount of murders in their country. Ethiopia is number 4 on the list for murders per year. They have a population of 102 million people. Strict background checks, mental health exams, and health assessments are required in order to purchase a firearm. You must obtain a permit in order to purchase one. Indonesia is number 5 on the list with 261 million people. They had 18,963 murders in 2016. Indonesia has strict gun laws. Licenses must be obtained for citizens to obtain a firearm, and they generally are only issued to people who are in a profession that involves firearms, such as military, law enforcement, so on and so forth. There is an exception for politicians and businessmen because they happen to be targets of violence. So just looking at the top 5 countries for murders, we can see that all 5 of these countries have much stricter gun laws than we do here in the United States. However, they have much higher rates of violence than we do here in the United States. Again, there is no correlation between strict gun laws and a reduction in murder. And that is something that I cannot drive home enough. I could go through the next 5 or next 4 on the list. Nigeria, South America, Colombia, and Russia all have much stricter gun laws than the United States. All of them have fewer people in their country than the United States, and all of them have more murders overall. In fact, Russia, while most people think Russians are crazy and they all have guns, has really strict gun laws, and very similar to what a lot of the proposals have been of what we should adopt. I'll go ahead and read their policies here real quick, just for conversation's sake. In Russia, there's a population of 144 million people. They had 14,574 murders in 2016. Russian citizens over 18 years of age can obtain a firearms license after attending a gun safety class and passing a federal test and background check. The license is for 5 years and may be renewed. Firearms may be acquired for self-defense, hunting, or sports activities. Carrying permits may be issued for hunting firearms licensed for hunting purposes. Initially, purchase is limited to smooth-bore, long-barred firearms and pneumatic weapons with muzzle energy of up to 25 joules. Basically, you can own a shotgun with your first firearms license or something like an air gun. After 5 years of shotgun ownership, rifles may be purchased. Handguns are generally not allowed. Rifles and shotguns with barrels less than 31 inches long are prohibited, as are firearms that shoot in bursts and have more than 10 cartridge capacity. Suppressors are prohibited. An individual cannot possess more than 10 guns, up to 5 shotguns and 5 rifles, unless they are part of a registered gun collection. Again, pistols in the United States are the main killer of individuals. Almost all of the 11,000 murders committed by firearm were committed by a handgun. In Russia, they literally banned the possession of handguns, and yet they still have more people murdered than the United States, with a third of the population. Several people say, well, we should have a permitting process for our Second Amendment rights. That is what Russia has. Not only do you have to take a course, you have to pass a test and a strict background check. People talk about, well, we need to limit the types of guns that you're able to own. That's precisely what Russia does. Again, they have a third of the population and more murders than we do here in the United States. So overall, gun laws do not reduce violence. In fact, if you look at Australia, if you look at the United Kingdom, if you look at a lot of the countries where they have put forth strict gun laws, immediately after those strict gun laws, violence rates and murder rates increase. They generally do so for a period of about 5 years, and then they go back to the level before the gun restrictions were put in place. Meaning it is not an issue with the tools used, it is an issue with the culture. And that is what we have to continue to look at to address. A lot of the proposals that I've seen online and people discuss on how to reduce gun violence have to do with limiting the amount of ammo that you can purchase. On a given day at a training range, if you want to be proficient with your weapon, you'll put 500 to 1,000 rounds through your gun. Most of the mass shootings that have occurred, you can only carry so much ammunition loaded in your magazines, right? Most, on average, have involved less than 200 rounds fired. So if we're going to reduce the amount of ammunition you can actually own to the point where we're reducing the amount of ammunition fired in these events, we're talking about reducing it to beyond the training limit. 500, again, is a standard day at the shooting range. And 200 or less is the standard amount of rounds fired in one of these events. So that proposal would do nothing but just impede our ability to be effective with our weapons. Ending concealed carry. Again, there is no evidence to suggest, if you go state by state and you look at the murder rate per capita, those who have concealed carry laws and those who don't, there is no correlation between concealed carry laws and the reduction in murder rates. Looking at the assault weapons ban. The assault weapons ban was in 1994 to 2004. During that time period, 20 mass shootings occurred, if not more. That's when Columbine occurred, was in 1999, right in the middle of this assault weapons ban. It did not prevent the mass murder events from occurring. Other things that have been proposed. Voluntary buybacks, like what Australia did. What most people don't realize is the voluntary buyback program in Australia only took in about a third of the overall guns in the country, meaning 2/3 of gun owners in Australia did not adhere to the new law. They still own firearms. So a voluntary buyback is something that probably would not fly well in the United States. Yeah, sure, some people might actually bring those back in. However, a lot of people have also suggested that an involuntary buyback program or an involuntary gun confiscation program should occur. Again, I can refer you to the other 9 countries that I mentioned already in this video, but I can also mention that people take their gun rights very seriously in this country, and when we look at it, you are looking at armed conflicts arising because you want somebody to come into someone else's home and take those weapons from them. It is not a recipe for reducing violence, it's a recipe for increasing violence, because people will defend their rights violently if necessary. Expanded background checks. Folks, we have background checks in the United States. The people who have been committing these crimes have passed the background checks. Why have they done that? Well, in one instance, the Air Force, in multiple instances, the Air Force and other military other military wings have essentially failed to report instances of domestic violence. So those don't come up on the background checks. Your states are not required to use the same system, and some of them do, but inadequately. The FBI has continuously missed reports of these individuals and allowed these people to purchase guns through the background check system. The background check system, I agree, needs to be beefed up and it needs to be consistent, but our government needs to get its act in order and start reporting the crimes committed by these individuals and start focusing on the reports that these individuals may be ready to commit these acts of terror on its citizens, which they are failing to do. So the background check situation we can talk about background checks all day, but it's been ineffective thus far from preventing these things from occurring. And again, even if we bar the legal sale of firearms in America, there's still 300 million guns. And most of your criminals who have guns now did not obtain them legally. They did not. They got them through illegal means. They got them through private hand-to-hand exchanges, through the black market. So we're not actually preventing the bad people from obtaining weapons. It's almost an impossible thing to do in our country because guns are so prolific. So instead of focusing on how we can reduce the accessibility to firearms, perhaps we should look at the actual cause as to what would make an individual want to murder 17 of his own peers. Again, I've brought up the data over and over and over again. The people who are committing these acts are also the people who are being underserved in our school systems and our society. We need to look at what is going on in our schools, in our workplaces, in our healthcare system. Instead of, prescribing to 1 in 6 Americans these anti-psych meds, perhaps we should be counseling instead. Perhaps instead of creating a stigma around seeking psychological help, we should be creating a culture focused on helping individuals in need. These are the things we have to do if we want to actually reduce the overall amount of homicide and murder and violent crime in our nation. Until we do that, until we end the drug war, until we stop using coercion and humiliation and shame as our main means of control, we will not solve this problem. And that is where I stand on this. And if you have something you want to add to the conversation, I absolutely encourage you to leave a comment in the YouTube channel or on Facebook or on Twitter. I want to hear what you have to say because I actively want to solve this problem. But I will tell you right now, based on all of the evidence that I've looked at, based on all the data I've collected, reducing the accessibility of firearms will not solve this problem. We have to be introspective and we have to consider how we treat each other. We have to be introspective and focus on how we're treating our students, how our school system's operating, and solve this from a cultural standpoint. Otherwise, we're just going to continue to do the same thing after each one of these events occur. Move to our respective positions, fire off volleys of the same reused, talking points, and get absolutely nowhere. So if you like this video, I would really appreciate it if you'd hit the like and share button. Again, I am not accepting donations larger than $100 from any one individual. So big money donors and PACs, I am not taking part of that. And every single like and share is helping to advance my visibility on social media and overall. So with that, I will catch you guys next time.